On March 26, 2003, just mere weeks before his 8th birthday, Dalton Mesarchik was waiting in his front porch for a van to take him to an event at his church. The van never showed, but Dalton would never be seen alive again. Was Dalton taken by a child abductor from the Streator, Illinois area, or was it someone just passing through? I'm Eric Carter Londine.
And I'm Charlie Worrell.
And this is Crime Lines and Consequences. Welcome to another episode of Crime Lines and Consequences. Today we are joined by our very good friend and one half of the Navigating Advocacy podcast, Miss Whitney. Welcome, Whitney.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us.
I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're joining us today.
Me too. Can you tell us a little bit about Navigating Advocacy?
Sure. Like Eric said, I'm one half of this podcast. The better half is Melissa. And we started as a little podcast called Cults, Crimes, and Cabernet. We started over a glass of wine with a conversation between two friends. And then we met families and fellow advocates, Charlie, Eric, multiple missing people's families, and decided that we were doing things the wrong way. And we wanted to help families because Melissa and I are both very hands-on people. We are the people that just jump in to get things done, no matter what it is. Even if we don't have that skill set, we'll figure it out and we'll get it done. So we recently went through a rebranding and we are now Navigating Advocacy Podcast. I've still not gotten used to saying it because my mouth just doesn't want to make the words, even though we talk for a living.
I am a big fan of the work that you do, that you and Melissa do, the way that you get involved in these cases, the way that you folks show up and help search for missing people. It's just a huge inspiration. It definitely keeps me going. So I'm glad you're here today with us. So thanks for joining.
Yeah, the way you guys show up. And one of the things that I know for me that kind of holds me back sometimes, I'm like, I got these small kids. They got a school thing. I got a job. I got all this. You and Melissa have all that, and you still do it, and you still show up. So you're an inspiration to the community.
Absolutely.
Oh, thank y'all. That means so much.
Especially those of us who like to make excuses, like me.
All right, enough with the small talk. Let's get into the case here. So Whitney, why don't you tell us a little bit about Dalton's case?
Okay, so I decided to bring this case to you guys because it's one that I can resonate with. It is about a 7-year-old boy. I have a 7-year-old son. Dalton was born April 29th, 1995 to Michelle Mesarchik and George Scott. He lived in Streator, Illinois. And Charlie, you can resonate with this because he was one of 6 kids in the family.
It's not appropriate in a true crime episode, but usually when someone says something about having 5 or 6 kids, I make a snarky comment about them being a breeder. Which I can say because as a fellow breeder, yes, 6 kids. That's a lot of kids. I promise.
It was
a lot.
And it's split directly down the middle. 3 boys, 3 girls. There was no tiebreakers. It was even down the middle. Streator's a small town in north central Illinois. Roughly 14,000 people live there. Dalton's parents did get divorced around 2001. But they remained living together off of West Morrill Street to save money. It makes perfect sense when you have 6 kids and having 2 households. If you can co-parent in the same household and still get along and still benefit from having a 2-income household for your kids, it made perfect sense to me for them to remain together. This street that they lived on is exactly what you imagine for small town Illinois as well. It's tree lined, it's wide, it gives enough room for street parking, and you can just envision kids riding their bikes or playing a pickup game of basketball down the street. It's 2 blocks from the Streator Township High School that has been there since the 1800s. On paper, it looks and sounds like your dream neighborhood. Like a lot of 7-year-old boys, Dalton enjoyed riding his bicycle, but he wasn't really a wanderer. He stayed nearby. His mom called him the super glue kid because he was always checking in with his mom of, hey, I'm still here playing outside. Dream kid, right? Because moms are always wondering where your kids are when they're outside. He always rode close to home. He was really into Harley Davidson motorcycles. He had collector's items, models everywhere. He even made his mom promise that when he turned 18, she would buy him a motorcycle. It was a way she could get off his back of, when you're 18, you can have a motorcycle. I'm not buying it for you before then. You're getting it when you're 18.
Yeah. My 19-year-old wants a motorcycle, and I'm like, I wish I could put him off. He's a grown up with his own money.
Yep.
I think it's just really sweet, this picture that you painted of him. You really get a sense of who he was and what he was excited about, and the things that he probably talked his mom's head off for hours about, that she probably really didn't care about, other than the fact that he was super excited about it. And I just love that. And I love the idea of him convincing his mom to get him a motorcycle when he's 18. I don't think I would have been able to do that at that age. He just sounds like a really persuasive bundle of energy.
Like many 7-year-olds also, he was smart, he was artistic, and he had a ton of friends in school, which reminds me of my 7-year-old. He's the talker, he's the social butterfly, he's going to talk to strangers in public, and that's what Dalton did. The local motorcycle club knew him well enough to give him his own nickname within the club. They all called him Little Dude, and all loved him, waved at him when they would see him in town. He was well known. He also enjoyed attending church activities, and not just his own family church, any church. On March 26, 2003, when he had asked his parents to attend a church event that day, they didn't see any reason to tell him no. It wasn't their usual church, like I said, but Dalton had attended a couple events there before, and his parents didn't have to make arrangements for pickup or drop off because this church offered a shuttle service. They had a van that went around, would pick you up before the event, take you to the church, bring you home afterwards, which, as a parent with kids and extracurriculars, that sounds like a dream. To not have to worry about who's taking who where at what time. You just knew he was going to be picked up and dropped off.
And it's something that is pretty common, I think. If people that may not be involved in churches may not actually know, that is a common thing that happens. I used to ride a bus to church when I was a little kid that would come to my grandma's house and pick me up. So it's not something that is weird or strange. If you haven't been exposed to it, it's pretty normal.
It was weird to me when I first moved to Oklahoma and someone said, the church bus comes through and picks kids up. And I'm like, you just put your kid out on the lawn in the church. Like, I grew up in Connecticut. Maybe they do it in some parts of Connecticut, but not where I grew up, not in my hometown. So it was new to me, but it makes sense. It helps church attendance. It helps parents. It gets kids somewhere where they're supervised. It makes sense.
And if you're sending your kid to this event anyway, it seems to already be a trusted establishment. Dalton's 12-year-old sister was also attending this event, but in true girl fashion, she wanted to go with her friends. Why would she ride with her brother when she could go to her friend's house to be picked up instead? It's that ever-evolving conversation of why do women go to the bathroom alone? It starts at an early age. Dalton threw on his leather jacket and his Hot Wheels shoes and stepped outside to watch for the van around 6:45 in the evening. Dalton was much more patient than my kids would be, and around 15 minutes later, he pops his head back inside to check in with his mom and say, "Hey, I'm still out here waiting." Michelle asked him to stay inside the enclosed porch while he was waiting. The sun had already gone down, the temperatures were starting to drop as well, and this front porch was fully enclosed, and it appeared to be more of a finished garage as opposed to like a screened-in front porch that you can imagine when someone says front porch. It was an actual structure. Dalton heads back outside to the porch, and then 7:45 rolls around. His sister pops through the door asking where Dalton was, the same sister that's supposed to be going to this event. Michelle was a little bit confused. Her daughter said the van never picked them up, but maybe they just forgot to stop at that friend's house, and Dalton was picked up and was at church. That's a common thought process for me. Michelle calls up the church just to check in, make sure Dalton did indeed make it to the event. And this is the first time she's notified that the church wasn't doing pickups that day. Their regular van driver was unable to make it in due to a family emergency, and he had to leave the state, so they weren't doing pickups. But because they weren't regular attendees, they weren't on the phone list to call saying, "Hey, we're not going to pick up." Michelle and George head outside yelling Dalton's name, thinking maybe he's just around the corner of the house. He's out there with his bike. doing things that little boys do outside, still waiting for the van. When they received no response at all from Dalton, they contacted law enforcement, and this was by 8:34 or so in the evening. Temperatures were around 56 degrees and just getting colder, but police officers showed up very quickly, and I was impressed that they already had scent dogs with them. They brought in the bloodhounds and immediately began searching.
Wow, that's amazing that they did that. I don't think I've heard of any response to a missing person be that aggressive that fast, at least not in the cases that I've covered. So I'm glad to hear that they were on top of it immediately.
Especially in a small town. It is between kind of Chicago and Peoria, so maybe they were able to get dogs in really quickly, but smaller towns, when you have to bring in the dogs from somewhere else, sometimes it can take a while even if they want to move quickly. So that's amazing that not only did they move quickly, but they were able to.
If that impresses you, what happens over the next little bit is going to even further impress you. The dogs were able to pick up Dalton's scent from the door and tracked it to the center of the road where the scent then disappears. Of course, this leads law enforcement to immediately theorize that Dalton got in a vehicle. If it disappears in the middle of the road, common sense says someone picked him up. That sends panic throughout the entire community. They send out a Amber Alert, and this is in a time where on local channels, an Amber Alert would be on the ticker tape along the bottom, or that's what we called it when I worked in the news industry, the ticker tape that runs along the bottom, it was just a constant banner. It's like when there's bad weather. It just runs along the bottom of the screen nonstop in a loop. That's what was happening in this community. Law enforcement, the parents, the older siblings, they're all searching the area, still continuing to look for any sign of Dalton. Could he have fallen down, hurt his leg? Who knows? Trying to remain optimistic, as one does. By the next morning, by 10 a.m. the next morning, there is a command center set up at City Hall. Authorities put out a call to the community requesting help. More than 500 residents showed up with cars, four-wheelers, horses, boats, their tennis shoes, walking sticks, you name it. The community was hands-on and ready to help.
That's exactly what you want as a family member who is trying to get something like that done. Kudos to that community. Kudos to the police department for doing everything right. An Amber Alert that early on in the 2000s, amazing.
The FBI and county sheriff's office even pulled their resources in to aid in the search. Flyers were printed and posted on street corners. It's the type of response in movies, but you do not usually see these in our research in these instances. These types of responses are few and far between. They really did everything they could as quickly as possible. The grid search on foot turned up no leads until a fisherman on the Vermilion River spotted a body floating in a popular fishing spot near the Vermilion Boat Club. This was just over the county line, less than 3 miles from Dalton's home. He had seen the news reports and missing flyers and immediately knew it was Dalton, and had the wherewithal about him to secure his body to prevent him from floating further downriver, stayed with him, and flagged a passerby to contact the police. Officers were able to get out there very quickly and secure the scene so that no one had access. This is top-notch police work. Crime scene was blocked off. No one was out there, which is impressive to say considering there was 500 people out trekking around the area looking for something. You could have easily contaminated a crime scene that way. The following days, crime scene investigators processed the scene and collected everything they could to test it. It's not ever really been released what they found at that exact location or that exact day, or if anything was on Dalton's body or not. The case was very secure, and only the very few details law enforcement wanted to release were released. Again, kudos with the amount of people involved in this.
Water always makes it hard to test evidence. So my thought, just thinking, what could they have found that they may be able to test? Because that's where my brain goes right away. Clothing, if he was in the water, if anything was trying to weigh him down, or was he just dumped in the water? There are a lot of factors there, but I would hope that they had something they could test.
By the end of the day, on March 27th, approximately 30 investigators were assisting across multiple agencies. the state police, the local police, several county sheriff's offices, the FBI. This was one of 2 murders reported in the previous 3 years in the area. So again, the fact that they knew the processes to take when not having that much experience with murder or homicide is amazing.
Yeah. How many cases have we covered where we say, oh, it's a small town, they didn't have murders, they didn't know what they were doing? Or it's a big town and they're overrun with murder, so they don't have time. We always seem to have qualifiers for why the police response wasn't what it should be. Yet here we have a situation where they're doing everything right.
That's a really good point. I think that's something that we should all consider when we're thinking about these cases. Is it a matter of they were too busy or they didn't have enough experience, or is it a matter of they just weren't doing the right things? Because clearly it can be done when you are a small department with not a lot of experience.
On March 28th, just 2 days after Dalton's disappearance, the police held a press conference alerting the public that they were investigating it as a homicide. They had received 70 tips, including car descriptions, people pointing out that only a local could know that fishing spot. The entire town immediately, of course, was shrouded in both grief and fear. Parents were walking their children everywhere. Police were alerting families, do not trust your children outside alone. We don't know who could have done this. The fear was real and palpable in the neighborhood. By the 29th, the tips almost doubled to 130, and the amount of investigators was up to 50. On April 1st, they laid Dalton to rest. He was buried in a motorcycle t-shirt, a bandana, and sunglasses. He had stuffed animals. He had some of his collectibles with him, and the room had his artwork hung proudly. The local motorcycle club even honored him with a missing man formation en route to the graveside ceremony. If you don't know what that is, I grew up in a motorcycle family. It's the motorcycle club will ride out with one blank, empty, open spot in there while they're driving to honor whoever was lost. It was their honorary spot in the formation.
It's just a really touching description. I think like the idea that we have Dalton's art around the entire memorial, the fact that he's in his leather jacket with his sunglasses, like it's just clearly so much love and thought and care went into honoring him and who he was as a person. I'm going to get emotional just thinking about it.
I talk a lot on Crime Lines about never knowing what part of a case will really hit you. And so sometimes it's something like this where you really can picture it. For me, when I was looking over the research on this, it was his freaking Hot Wheels shoes. Like when they're describing what he was last seen in, I started Hot Wheels shoes and I was like, I can't go any further. And we don't, obviously with kid cases, there are so many points there, but with every case, you never really can think about what detail is the one that's going to get you, that's going to make you, as Whitney works really hard with advocacy and reminding people these are real people, these moments that of humanity in these quote unquote stories that we're sharing. So yeah, I'm right there with you, Eric.
I wasn't going to put this in because I choked up just writing and reading through the research on this, but when his mom is interviewed after his funeral, she talks about his artwork and how she proudly displays them because it's the only artwork she will ever have of his. And that got me. I cried 3 times reading the same sentence over the last few days going over these notes. That is what got me. Also, what got me is this motorcycle club. They have this big burly, everyone's, a motorcycle club. They must be thuggish and rugged and hard. They had little patches made for all of their leather cuts that said little dude on them. And they all wear them for him. And it's just, my heart sinks every time. That very same day that Dalton was laid to rest, police released information that he had died of blunt force trauma and that they were offering a $1,000 reward.
Poor baby.
Timing could have been a little bit better, but also they are fighting very hard to find who did this to Dalton. So I'll let it slide. April 2nd, a coroner's inquest was held. And this is the first time I've ever heard of this. Have y'all ever heard of this before?
The coroner's inquest? Not I cover international cases and hear about it quite often there, not as much here.
Yeah, it's more
Mhm.
across the pond.
It lasted 15 or so minutes, and one witness was called. 10 questions were asked, and they were all answered with a yes or a no. The deputy clerk read the autopsy results and stated that Dalton's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head due to an assault. The jurors took 10 minutes to come to a consensus that Dalton had been murdered. 2 days after that, America's Most Wanted stated that they would be covering Dalton's story. They shot it, they aired it, and once it aired, 16 leads came into law enforcement. And this is what's unreal. Already we have national media attention within a week, 10 days, less than 10 days on this one. It's amazing what we can do when we set our minds to it. By April 11th, the investigators were able to weed out any of the leads that weren't tangible, and over half of the investigators were reassigned. Then Dalton's case really starts to slow down. 10 days after that, they reran the segment, which that's a quick rerun. A dozen more leads came in from the rerun, including one tip that led them to a benchtop pro handheld sledgehammer. It had a metal head and a wooden handle and weighed 3 pounds. This hammer they found, which some reports say they found it in a dumpster. Some reports say it may have been closer to where they found Dalton's body. Couldn't confirm one way or the other because a police officer never came out and said it. It was a lot of media reports. But this hammer did have blood that matched Dalton's. This very specific brand of hammer was also only sold at Kmart's, which, if y'all don't know what Kmart is, you're missing out on some blue light specials.
Does it even exist anymore? I don't think it does.
I don't think so either. It was just a department store.
Yeah, we had one here in Kansas City forever, and I'm pretty sure it went out of business a few years ago. I never went to it. I'm a Target girl, sorry.
Once again, police reached out to the public, asking them to check their belongings to see if anyone was missing one. They worked with Kmart to gain a list of sales of this specific item from this specific Kmart, and they were able to cross them off one by one as the public called in to say whether they still had theirs. Brilliant police work, in my mind, yet again. April 29th would have been Dalton's 8th birthday. Michelle had already purchased his presents, a new pair of Harley boots, and some more Harley-Davidson motorcycles to add to his collection. The town gathered and left candles, balloons, cards, stuffed animals outside of his home, just remembering Dalton. The lead slowed to a halt in the coming weeks, and by the following year, law enforcement decided to release that Dalton had suffered other injuries outside of blunt force trauma, but those additional injuries were not what caused his death. They also never released whether or not sexual assault was a motive or something that had happened to Dalton. We do know that they had called all of the sex offenders in the area. Not many lived near Dalton because of his proximity to the school. So it would have had to have been someone casually driving down the road, I would assume. By July 21st of 2003, multiple agencies had donated towards a reward, and it was up to $10,000. But no new leads or suspects arose. By the 1-year mark of Dalton's death, police held a news conference saying that they had a suspect that had been identified by a private lab on the evidence that they had recovered. But they just needed one piece of information. They put out more flyers with Dalton's picture, the sledgehammer that they found, and where the body was found out into the universe. On April 1st, 2004, 4 new billboards announcing the now $11,000 reward went up, and over 600 leads came in the first 5 days. More evidence was tested at a private lab. They continued to say, we're waiting for results, we're waiting for results. By the 15th of April, the reward was increased to $50,000. The task force claimed to have multiple people of interest. They were conducting hundreds of interviews, but by June, the billboards were taken down. The leads stopped filtering in, and the case slowed to a standstill. On the 3-year mark, a candlelight vigil was held. Police stated that they were waiting for technology to catch up before they could test some of the evidence.
And that often happens with the DNA. For anyone who doesn't know, when you test DNA, you destroy the sample. So if you test it and it's a small amount and our testing doesn't test that tiny amount, we don't have PCR testing or whatever at this point, over testing the evidence too often or too frequently may destroy everything you have. So when the technology catches up to where we need it to be, we don't have the evidence anymore. So sometimes it feels, oh my gosh, the evidence was sitting there for 20 years and they finally got around to testing it. And that's not always true. Technology finally got to where they could confidently test it.
This is something that we are seeing. We're still waiting on DNA results from the foot search that we participated in over a year ago, because DNA degrades when it's in the elements. And then science, like you just said, technology is not there to be able to read what is left. So you have to be careful with it. They also talked about, law enforcement also spoke publicly that they had all of the puzzle pieces in Dalton's murder, but they couldn't figure out how to put the pieces together. You see this a lot also in investigations, because they're not ready to arrest anyone, because what if that one piece is slightly askew and they get off on the whole situation? They want to make sure all their ducks are in the right row before they can act on things. Michelle, like so many parents, siblings like Eric, loved ones, family members, was forced into advocacy for their children, for others' children, siblings. She's pushed for legislation, worked with NCMC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and continues to talk about Dalton every single day. On the 10-year anniversary, she stood up and was interviewed and said, "It's been 10 years and a million tears." But she continues to talk about Dalton. She believes that police know who committed this horrible crime and that they'll eventually make an arrest, but she's just holding faith in law enforcement. In 2021, police updated the press stating that they had investigated over 2,000 leads and had collected over 500 pieces of evidence in the then 18 years. This year, at the 20-year mark, the FBI released a seeking information alert, meaning they're still investigating this, trying to bring it back to the forefront of the public's mind, and they held a candlelight vigil. And this is where Dalton's case has remained for decades. We're still waiting.
One of the things that I've always found when I'm doing the research, something that's always difficult is I get in the newspaper archives and I'm following it day by day. Then it's week by week. Then we're on anniversary coverage. And when we hit anniversary coverage, that's when you know a case is getting cold. And then it's the 1 year, 2 year. Then it's not till the 10-year, the 15-year, the 20-year. That point in the research process, doing true crime research it's always a hard part for me, because I know that that's like a delineation of the active investigation and the cold case. And it's hard to see that. And to think we're at a 20-year mark in a case where they feel confident they have a lot of evidence, they have a lot of suspicion, they're being pointed in specific directions, but to still be in this spot, it's heartbreaking.
I think the inspiring part for me is hearing Michelle's resilience and her unwillingness to give up hope. It's something that is really important for other people who are in that situation to see and to hear and to understand, because it does get tiring and you do get worn down over time. So I'm glad to hear that she still has hope. I'm glad to hear that she trusts in the process. And I hope that she does get the answers that she deserves and that Dalton deserves.
I spoke a lot about Michelle, but his father, George, was also very involved in advocating as well. He just wasn't as vocal. He was there supporting his ex-wife in the journey. And unfortunately, he passed away in 2021 at 60 years old, not ever knowing what happened to his son.
I have a question going back on the investigation a bit. I read in the research that kind of around the time they were putting up some new billboards, they sent out questionnaires specifically to high school students. Am I reading too much into that? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know that the questionnaires were ever fully sent out. I know they had made plans to send them out, and I'm assuming it's because of the proximity of the high school to the location of where Dalton went missing, it just being 2 blocks down the road. Did anyone see him get into a vehicle or in the passenger seat of a vehicle, in the back of a pickup? Did anyone see anything? Because think about a high school, there's always people loitering around.
Right.
There's sports at night, there's late practices, there's kids being kids. So they could have easily seen something happen and not necessarily realize it until those questionnaires went out. I couldn't find a copy of the questionnaire or if it ever actually was distributed, but I know that there was a plan for it.
Because on the flip side of that, if there is a high school there, that means people driving by their house may be more likely to be high schoolers, and perhaps they are looking in the direction of a teenager for this. We're speculating here, obviously. The police have been pretty tight-lipped, which I think is very important if they have a suspect in mind. It's why I don't cover cases that are pending trial, because once you want to go to trial with something, you don't want to do anything to mess that up with the media, the police leaking things. But when I read specifically high school students, I was curious if that was the direction they were looking, or like you said, just for witnesses.
I think it's a tough balance too, right? How much information do you release? But you look at this case and they have a body, they have a cause of death, they have a weapon, they have a lot of circumstances that are probably pointing them in a direction. And the fact that they've been able to keep a lid on all of it, to your point, I think it does protect the investigation. And I think that's probably why you're hearing Michelle echo that sentiment, that they know who it is and they're trying to get more information, more evidence. Because the worst thing that could happen is to take it to trial and then it all just falls apart because there isn't enough to tie that person to what happened.
It does feel like they've given out important parts. So sometimes I'll read a case and they had the description of a car in the area, but they didn't put it out for a while. In this case, they're like, we have a hammer. Here's what it looked like. Let's move on that. Here's where it was found. Like, they're giving the right amount of information that the public would need to call in a tip. So this investigation, I think it's a great example for people who are running investigations to look at. I did a little map view of the area, just thinking, okay, well, this is between Chicago and Peoria. So lots of people coming through. I was like, how far are they off the highway? And they are far enough off the highway that I wouldn't expect someone passing through to have just so happened to see Dalton out front.
It would have had to have been very coincidental if the right predator was driving down this neighborhood street in the 45 minutes that Dalton was outside and potentially be able to either coerce him into a van. Maybe he thought it was the church van. Maybe it's a vehicle that looks similar to a church van, so he got into it. Or it could just be anyone's car. They don't know exactly what vehicle he got into, what type of vehicle. They're just assuming that it had to be something similar to the church van because he had only ridden this church van 2, maybe 3 times. So he may not have an adequate memory of exactly what the van he's supposed to get into looks like. But a very specific predator with a van, it seems too coincidental. There's no way that many things could line up for that small time frame in my mind. Because I thought the same thing. A highway, it's not just someone on a highway swinging through.
Yeah, it makes me think of the Athena Strand case a little bit, where she was the little girl playing outside and a FedEx driver came by. It was somebody who was supposed to be in the area, somebody that my kids love the UPS guy. They love the mailman. They don't feel like that's a stranger. Mm-hmm. And so it almost makes me think, I'm not blaming some FedEx driver in their town, but what if it was somebody that a child wouldn't necessarily immediately feel is a stranger? Whether that means it is a mailman or somebody in uniform. I think there are a lot of things other than it being looking like a church van that could explain why Dalton would go get in that vehicle. And that doesn't necessarily mean he knew the person, just that it wasn't someone a child at that age, they're impulsive, would have necessarily seen as a threat.
I also think that they're still weighing heavily on it being a potential local person, given the fact that this fishing area where he was found. It's not a easily accessible place. At one point, they had talked about they had seized a boat for evidence potentially, but nothing ever really came from what they found in a boat, if they really actually did have a boat. And I don't know that you could just drive up, and if it's the type of river that you can just drive right up to and unload something into the river. Again, there's so many questions, and the fact that they have this many pieces of evidence and it's still not closed is mind-boggling.
Hopefully more coverage will get the story to that person who moved out of town but knows something and now they feel safe coming forward. I covered a case on Crime Lines recently where that literally happened. Someone knew something. She actually knew everything. She knew exactly what happened and who did it and who paid who to do it. But she was in an abusive relationship. And 10 years later, she was living in Texas. This happened in Atlanta. And one of those tabloid TV shows like Extra, Inside Edition, one of those ran this segment. And she heard the parents talk about their grief. And it made her realize that she had to be brave enough to come forward. And she did, and closed the case.
Wow.
Like 20 years down the road. That can happen. And that's why families are out there doing this media and national media and putting their trauma out there for the public to dissect. Because I know there were rumors that his family was involved, which is not something the police believe. We're talking gossipy rumors. You put yourself out there for that when you bring your story public, but sometimes it's what you have to do.
Yeah, I think this conversation around the idea that, and it's something that somebody had tweeted, somebody that we're not going to mention, had tweeted with regards to the Michael Cherney verdict or acquittal, and said, oh, this goes to show what this kind of advocacy is going to do. It's going to just pack the court system with these people who are not going to be brought to trial or not going to be found guilty, and insinuating that there's more nefarious reasons behind doing this, behind putting yourself out there. Like people are trying to purposely fabricate and manufacture situations to bring people to court. And I just think that it's really frustrating because you look at somebody like Michelle, who is really just trying to get answers about her son, probably doesn't want to be talking about this all the time, probably doesn't want to be on the news, reliving her most awful, traumatic, worst day possible. And I just think that it's really unfair to portray families that are fighting for justice like that.
One thing that came up when we covered Pepita Redhair was that her mom had to do all this advocacy while taking care of other kids, while working a job. And it's the same situation here. Advocating for a case doesn't pay well unless you're selling books and making podcasts. If you are doing it as the family advocate, you're not getting paid for that. And even as people, and I say that as someone who does make money on my podcast, even as other people are making money on your story, you're not.
Right.
And you have other people to take care of. And then people are dissecting your every move, every single thing you say, blaming you for trying to get attention because your dad was BTK. This is what families who are out there trying to actually help have to go through constantly.
She had talked about how when those rumors and threats came through, she doesn't even live in Streeter anymore. She left because it was too much for her.
Wasn't someone stalking her?
Yes. People were just causing a lot of problems. And she is living with the media attention, which is national at this point. So not only it was on America's Most Wanted, people are doing the ridiculous fangirl thing of, it was this house that Dalton went missing from. And she's having to deal with that. The townsfolk are, some townsfolk are running around saying she killed her own son. She did this to her own child. And her 5 living children are having to deal with the fact that people are saying this about their mother or their father, or all the media attention you're having to deal with missing your brother, having to grow up in this world. Nobody thinks about what these families are having to do on top of having the energy to fight for their loved one to stay at the forefront of people's minds to get some answers.
It's so true. It's so true. And I always say some people will never know what it's like to fight for justice for a loved one, and good for them.
We've ranted on enough. We are curious about your thoughts. If you want to reach out on social media, we're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Let us know your thoughts on families advocating for cases, what they deal with in the media. Do you think some of the criticism towards families is sometimes fair? Do you think it's always unfair? Where do you fall on that? Let us know. We post about our episodes almost every time we post one. We'll get it up there. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And thank you so much, Whitney, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And go check out Navigating Advocacy wherever you get your podcasts, occasionally on YouTube, and give them a follow, a subscribe, whatever the button says.
And we'll see you next time.